When I was 17 years old, and the year was 1972, I went to a party, and at some point during the party, and I really don't know why this happened. I'm not claiming I went to the hospital and was diagnosed dead, but I must have either lost consciousness or I don't know what happened. But I started to move. Actually, to begin with, I heard a deep, deep rumbling. And this rumbling was really, really, it was not only low, it was vibrating through my body and through everything I could perceive. And it should have been scary, but it was just intriguing to me. It wasn't scary at all. And then suddenly, before I could think, I was moving through this black expanse. And I call it a tunnel now, but I wonder if that's just because what people have called it over the years. It was 1972, and I had nothing to call it then. And I'm moving really, really fast, and I don't know how fast. And up ahead, I can see a light way off in the distance. A very bright one, but it's not coming into this tunnel. And as I'm moving towards it, I have this thought that keeps going through my head. I'm about to learn the secret meaning of life. And it was just really, it was the only thought I had. So as I got near the exit, or what I would call the exit, the opening where the light began, I was above these valleys and these lush fields of flowers, and these flowers were gigantic, some of them, and there were rivers, but the flowers I particularly remember because they could have been 40, 50, I don't know, maybe 100 feet big, but I'm up above them and I'm looking down. So as I'm looking down at them, this music is filling the air, and I realize that it's coming from them and apparently from everything I'm seeing, and it's resonating within me. And as I look at them, they're moving. They actually have movement, and I understand, and I don't know why I understood, but I understood they were there to support me. So I continued to move forward at a rapid speed, but it was all very pleasing. It was all very comfortable. And up ahead on the right, I saw three tall, what I would call tall figures. And I think they were men and women. I don't really know which was which, but that's what I perceived. Because their features weren't really clearly delineated. As I looked at them, I could see that they were beings of light, I guess is what you would call it. And back behind them was that really bright light, but it was still off in a distance, but everywhere I was filled with light. And I wasn't aware that I had a body. I never saw hands, feet. I was aware, I felt exactly like I was there, like I do right now, but I just didn't have the ability to do this, nor was I trying to do it. And as I approached these three beings, they greeted me and they let me know that there was going to be a being of a very high order coming to meet me. And I was very excited. And I need to stop here and clarify something. I'm sure a lot of your viewers and yourself have probably heard this before, but there wasn't any language. Nobody's moving a mouth, and it's instantaneous communication. Not just instantaneous thought, but instantaneous understanding and comprehension. So I understood I was going to meet this being, and that bright light in the distance, which was brighter than all the light we had, started moving closer and closer to me until finally it was slightly above and in front of me. And I would say I perceived it as a male presence and very large, maybe, I don't know how large, 15 feet, 20 feet in height. But this light was being generated off of him. And it wrapped up everything, including myself. And it was, these parts are always hard to describe because all we have are words. But it was as if somebody was giving me the warmest greeting, hug, and love that I'd ever received in my life. It was all encompassing. I was wrapped up in it, and my mind began to flood with all these questions. And I remember the being was very happy about it, not laughing at me, but really joyful would be the word. And I could sense the joy. I was part of that joy. And I started to rapid fire ask questions, and again, ask there, it was just, you began to think it, and then suddenly you had the answers. So hypothetically, if I thought about a drop of water, I would become the water. I would become the rain. I would become the ocean. I might become the clouds. I'm being hypothetical here. That wasn't one I asked that I recall. But at some point in these questions, I asked, what is the meaning of life? And the being communicated to me, and again, not a word, but the feeling, the comprehension and understanding that it was love. And I was only 17, and I knew love more of it as a concept. I didn't really have I loved my girlfriend, I loved my dog and those kinds of things, but I didn't understand until then that there could be some love that was so all-encompassing, so amazing. And when I understood that, when I instantly understood that, I just burst out in this total joy, and I sort of went up in the air. I say I did, but I guess it was my presence, my spirit, and I started doing these somersaults in the air, like in joy. And I remember he was laughing. He was like, but not. He didn't find it funny. He felt it great. And I remember one of the questions I had was, are there other forms of life outside of the earth? And before I could even finish thinking it, because I was always infatuated with that as a kid, I was infatuated with the concept that there might be aliens. And I went zooming, I don't know how fast, it seemed like through galaxies instantly. And I looked down on a couple of different civilizations. And one of these was very, they dressed in what I would call like Roman style garb. And another one I came to was more what I would consider modern. This is 1972. But I didn't really get to interact with any of them because I was watching from above. So unfortunately, I realized later I probably could have willed myself down there. I wish I had thought of that. But it verified for me that there were other creations outside of the earth. And at some point after this, I'm taken to a black expanse. Like if it's hard to picture, but and it sounds very kind of dreary, but it wasn't. It was fine. It was warm. But I'm in this middle of, I guess, what you would call outer space, and there were stars and all these things off in the distance. And I can't quite remember if the three beings and the presence I was describing to you came with me. I think at least the three beings did. But at any rate, I was there, and suddenly in front of me, there was this, I guess what I would describe as a gigantic tablet spinning through space. And it stopped in front of me, and I saw the history of the world play out. And when I say I saw it play out, it was here and it was gone, but it was all absorbed by my knowledge. I could comprehend all of it. And I understood that I was linked to that event. To those events, that the whole world was linked to me, and I was linked to the whole world. Not in words, not like, well, this is why you're here and this is why they're there. I didn't really have that, but I had the very clear understanding that the world and I were not separate, and that everybody in the world and I were not separate. And I would just like to skip fast forward to, no, I don't recall how the world ends. A lot of people ask me that. What I was shown, I'm pretty convinced some of it was removed from me. I don't know that for a fact, but I believe that to be the case. But
let me.
Oh, go on.
Can I just jump in? Sorry, because you're on this point that you don't know how it ends, or you think some parts were kept from you. Was there anything that when you lived through it, you thought, well, I've seen this back then?
It all felt intimately familiar to me. I don't recall thinking to myself, oh, right, I remember being there for the Civil War, or I remember the creation of mountains or any of that. But it seemed normal. It seemed like, it didn't seem foreign to me. It did. And here's the weird thing. Well, there were a lot of weird things, but there was a lot of violence. And I remember seeing, and this is from a distance too, just like I was describing the planets. I remember seeing armies just rushing at each other, and death and violence. And I wasn't terrified, but, it was shocking to see. So in all of this mix, well, if you could imagine seeing everything from the beginning of time and understanding everything from the beginning of time of the world, that's what I had absorbed. And what happens from here is I decided, well, I'm not leaving. And I somehow made that clear, or I thought I did. And I was told, no, you have to go back. You have a mission. And again, these aren't words. I'm using the word mission, a purpose. It was clear to me that they wanted me to go back. And I resisted that. And it was emphasized, you have a very important reason to go back, a mission. I call it a mission. And I got surrounded they weren't real close to me, but they weren't far either. And I've tried to figure out the amount. It was at least hundreds. It could have been thousands of these beings of light. And they began to sing to me, much like the flowers had, but this was much more incredible. Yeah. And they were singing spontaneously. They were singing in harmony with each other, but it was all, it was spontaneous. It was all happening at that moment. And I understood they were singing in support of me returning. So I guess at that point, I must have agreed. I don't really recall saying, yes, I'll go back. But the next memory I have of anything, and by the way, all of this, I always like to point out to people, was vividly clear. It wasn't, it wasn't foggy or dreamlike. And I've told people it was more clear than anything in my life, including right now, right here, the conversation I'm having, because I just want them to understand that this wasn't some kind of, I understand what people who haven't had this, I can understand how they could feel. I would probably be one of those people if it didn't happen to me. But the next thing I know, I'm in a bathroom in this apartment where I was at this party, and I had a razor blade, and I was trying to slash my wrist because I knew, and I don't know how I knew, that if I died, I would return. And I just want to put a little caveat here. I wasn't in despair. It was the exact opposite of despair. It was joy. And I was only 17, and I just wanted to go back. The human part of me wanted to go back and be that spirit again. And this is the only time I've had what I would call a mystical sort of thing happen. A very deep male resonant voice said, no. I dropped the razor blade. Somebody knocked on the bathroom door and they said, guys, he's in here. It was a couple of guys who were at the party, and they found me. And that was how I left that. That from there, I went on with my life. But I was only 17, and there was no way for me to understand what had happened, because this is 1972. I had a girlfriend, and I told her the story the next day, or that it was probably the next day. And she's now my wife. We've been married over 50 years now. And she understood. She knew I wasn't, some sort of, excuse me. She knew I wasn't some sort of drug addict. And I'm not trying to disparage anybody, but that's not what happened to me. I don't know what happened physically to me. I do know what happened to me. But we got married and we had a baby. I went in the Air Force. I was in Denver, Colorado. This would probably be 73 or 4. It might have been 4. And the TV was on, and there was a doctor coming on a daytime TV show. And he was introduced as Dr. Raymond Moody, and he had written a book called Life After Life. And I go, okay, I'm listening. And I'm not really that intrigued, but all of a sudden he starts to describe the events. And I jump up and my wife looks at me and I go, that's it. The whole thing, because up to that point, a tunnel, all this, I had never, now maybe it existed in literature. I don't know. I'm not trying to say it didn't. I certainly never saw anything like this. And I had no I had no way to reference it. There was nobody I knew who had this. And I was an avid reader, and I'd never read about anything like this. And as he described it, I understood that's what happened to me. So that brings me up to having my human life.
And you mentioned, wanting to go back, and when you were there, wanting to stay, which, to be honest, I hear so often, because everybody talks about the love they feel, the unconditional love they
Yes.
feel over there. So, and most of the time, of course, NDEs come after an accident or a disease or like
Right.
some kind of like challenge or discomfort, so like all of a sudden you find yourself in this love. So it's very understandable that you wouldn't want to leave. But what I wanted to ask you is, then you came back. Did you ever regret, after that moment with those razors, did you regret being back? Did you feel sad that you weren't given the opportunity to stay there and discover more?
No, I did not feel sad. Once it was as if I accepted it once those events happened and I moved on with my life. I had been a very kind of introverted kid. I was intelligent and intuitive. And when I look back on it now, I realize I was always sort of spiritually seeking, not something I would have called myself then, but I realize now because I always had questions. I always wondered. But I do want to say about the suicide part, I really think, I believe that part of the reason I was told no is because nobody should kill themselves. That's my belief. I'm not saying I was told that. And I believe that we all have a mission here, all of us, every single one of us. And when I say every one of us, I really do mean 100%. And I know some people have a hard time with that because they want to say some people are inherently evil and could never be part of creation. But that's not my understanding of it.
So, based on that train of thought, those people that are evil, as we call them, or, people that want destruction, that want what we call bad things to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What is, in your understanding, their role in creation?
The best I can remember from seeing the events, there were so many events that pretty much summed up to me, and I realized that the world, the idea of the world, was constant invasion, domination, and subjugation of people. Again, not words that were told to me. It was just me reflecting back on it. And it made me realize that, or consider that the world is not our home. But for some reason, we're here, obviously. Here we are. And I think, this is my belief, that the reason we are here is we are here to awaken to what is really the world. And unfortunately, there are definitely people, as you described, that are so far from awakened that it is probably going to take a real long time. But time doesn't really exist there anyway. When you exit and you go there. And by the way, it is my profound belief that everybody will have an NDE. They'll either have multiple NDEs or but they're going to have an NDE because at some point you're going to have to exit this physical shell and you're going to have one. And I'm not trying to tell anyone how their NDE will play out because I've seen enough of them now over the years to understand that they are different in very many ways and they're very similar in very many ways. But it's almost like they are tailor-made when they occur. And it's almost like you're in kindergarten, like in a lower grade of school. Almost like, to me, this is how I perceive of it, as if you're being trained. Now, nobody told me that. This is just what I've come to believe.
I love that. And especially when you said that everybody has a mission, one of my beliefs is that challenges make you better. So if you had the easiest life possible, you would never find the qualities that so often we praise about ourselves and we're so proud of, right? Because you would never need to uncover those if you had the best, easiest life, just all cushy, right? So I tend to think people that are, bad actors, people that do things that make us all wonder why would anybody do that. I think they're just those human challenges, you know, that's the contrast, that's the opposition, and that should be what would make us all come together to fight against it and ultimately win and be better for it.
Yes, the way I perceive it is those people will ultimately arrive where we all will ultimately arrive. And I don't really want to mention names because it could infuriate certain groups of people. And I'm not a group believer. I'm not a group thinker. I was at one time. I did, when the internet was new, I was on there giving my opinion, but I really don't have opinions anymore. I have my beliefs and I have what I know to be true. And they are two different things. What I know to be true, I described to you at the beginning of this. And what some of my beliefs are, I've just described to you. And I think that since we're all on a mission, you know, if you look at any rescue mission, a rescue mission is really going into enemy territory and saving people. And I think that's what we're doing. And I believe, this is my belief again, I believe that the enemy territory I'm referring to is the world. Because I think the world was formulated, again, opinion, the world was formulated by us in opposition to what the Creator would have for us. I think creation would have us have what we already have, but fail to recognize, if that makes sense.
Actually, I'm struggling to understand that frame. So would you mind expanding upon it? Because I want to make sure I really get it. It sounds like a really good idea.
Yes. What I'm trying to say is that I believe that the world, here's how I think it happened. I think we were happy with the Creator and being united as one entity, all of us together. But at some point, we got this idea, I don't know who to blame for this, so I'll blame myself. Hey, God, what if we started this whole thing, no offense, but it's separate from you, and we just go off and do our own thing without you? And, you know, maybe God said, I'm speculating, you know, not a good idea, but I gave you that free will, and now here we are. And I believe this is what's happening. I think we simply made a mistake. I think the good news is that nothing here is truly real. And I'm not saying you're not here and I'm not here. I'm not in some sort of fantasy. But nothing real can ever be threatened. And that's where the peace of God lies. Because if this is all just something other than reality, which I believe it to be, and if reality is reuniting with the Creator and with each other, which I think ultimately we will do, then there's a deep peace that can be found in that, for me anyway.
Makes a lot of sense. And what I would liken it to is, you know, when we play a game of Monopoly or, you know, hide and seek, we take on different roles, right? And we say, well, we're all going to be hotel bosses and owners, and we're just going to fight each other for ownership. And then there's this game Risk that I used to play, which is basically conquering the world and taking over.
I kind of remember that. That was around a long time, right?
There we go, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think very often, especially after talking to so many people that are way more spiritually developed than I am and way more intuitive, it does seem like, you know, the bigger reality is something else, and this is sometimes a simulation, or it's sometimes not as real as we make it out to be. So I tend to think of it like that Monopoly game, right? When we say, like, you know, you're the owner of those hotels and I'm just going to be the up-and-comer that wants to come for your hotels. And we've agreed to play those roles, so we're acting in accordance to it. But we need to always keep in mind, we're not actually those hotel owners fighting, right? That's just a game.
That's a unique way to look at it. I really like that. And I would agree 100%. I think here we are playing out roles. In my life, I played a bunch of roles. I've been a musician, a singer, a songwriter. I was also a police officer for 30 years, which is all an accident. That all happened. It's kind of a long story. I'll skip it. But I never wanted to be a police officer, but because I was exposed to that, I was, it opened up things that, first of all, I was 17. It was 1972. I didn't even think cops were people. I looked down on them. You know, it was that era, and I bought into it. And when I realized that they are men and women, just like everybody, and some make mistakes, yes, and some are bad, but most are good. Most cops I worked with are fantastic people. But because I got this exposure that I never would have sought, it was all against my will. I was forced into it, really, in the Air Force. And then I became a civilian police officer in Rhode Island. But because I had that, I was exposed to things that never could have happened. And you were talking about suffering, bringing out some of that. I feel I haven't suffered like a lot of people I see suffer around me. You know, we all suffer because it's part of life, unfortunately. But I have a daughter, my oldest daughter, whose husband died in his late 30s from cancer and left 2 children with her. And because of that, it catapulted her into spirituality. She became a spiritual seeker, and she's found a lot of answers because of that. And I have another daughter who's finding them in a different way. What I've learned for myself is any of my spiritual beliefs, if someone like yourself asks me, more than happy to give them. But I try not to offer them to people. I try just to be aware and present. And if they ask me, then I'm more than happy to answer what I know or what I believe.
I completely agree. And I have to say, I always say we have the best audience, but that's very true because all the comments that I read, they're for 95% just positive and loving. And even if they disagree with any of the ideas or the guests, they do so in a respectful manner. There's always, you know, the weird 5%.
Oh, I know. I feel like I was a part of that 5% years ago. I got caught up in the whole group mentality. I really did. When the internet was new and everything. And luckily for me, I began to understand that I'm not an ego. I didn't really get that part. I knew I wasn't a body because that was clear to me that I wasn't a body from my experience at 17. But what I didn't quite get for a while is that I'm not an ego either. And I'm not even saying the ego's 100% bad. I just think the ego is not a good thing if you let it override your true identity.
That's very interesting. A very good way of looking at it. And it's, I think, the first time that I hear that the ego isn't completely bad I tend to not think of things as good or bad, but a bit in our way. And I think it sometimes just blurs, you know, just like glasses that don't work for you. It blurs the way we see things.
Yeah, that's very well put. I agree. Yeah, you're just not seeing clearly if you're trying to let your ego call the shots. The best thing I can do for what works for me is to I look at it like this. When I get upset, angry, judgmental, I have this concept I came up with of windows and mirrors. I actually have it on my YouTube site. It's called Wisdom Years, Wayne Morris. And if anyone's interested in that, I have a series they're very short videos, 2 to 3 minutes long. But this particular one talked about how when things are really ugly, when you're feeling rage, anger, judgment, or depression, the best thing I can do is to become a window, an open window, and let it move through me. And I actually visualize that. And then there are times when people are giving love, when they're giving blessings, that I need to become a mirror. And that's when I need to reflect it back.
That's a very good lesson that I think we can all use. And it actually leads me to my next question, because before we got to talking about your NDE, you mentioned you were about to understand the secret meaning of life.
Yes.
So what is the meaning of life?
Well, thank you for coming back to that, because it is just what I said. And a lot of people, the secret meaning of life is just what was communicated to me by the being of the higher order. And the being of the higher order, I was not given a name, and I was not raised religiously So I'm not anti-religion. I just wasn't raised. So I didn't have those preconceptions of who it might be. I've thought about it in the years past. So there's a couple of possibilities. And the answer was simply love. That is the entire meaning of life. I wasn't given any meaning beyond that, but I was given the understanding and meaning and the emotion, the acceptance of pure love. Because I think at least it's been my experience, most of us here just don't give 100% love all the time. I certainly don't even come close to 50 in my estimation. So there's always this bartering, this game, this withholding. And, the people who are more elevated can give it more freely. And I'm getting there. I'm very hopeful that I'll arrive there before I exit here. But that's really the whole meaning. And it can sound so trivial to say the meaning of life is love, because we're just using, here in the world, we only have symbols of symbols of symbols. We don't have the ability for me to put into you, or at least I haven't figured it out yet, exactly what was put into me, what I was given. And when we receive it, and we all will, then we'll understand. And all the judgments, they fall away, everything, anything, and that includes judgments against yourself. Now, I was only 17, but I've watched videos of people who had rough lives, and they were so despondent because they thought they were sinners, to use their words, and that they could never be accepted by God. And then they only to find out that none of it mattered, which is, I know some people here don't want to believe that. I understand that. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I understand their thinking. I was part of it. But there, you are just welcomed. You are totally accepted. You are not judged. And there is really here. And once we wake up to that, and we will, then we'll all be kind of nodding at each other and go, oh, okay.
I love that. And the one thing that I'm struggling to understand is, I think it's a beautiful message, but I think people often will say, well, what about that one person that annoys me? And let me give you an example, especially because you've been in the police and in the Air Force. I imagine that's a very individualistic culture, and you're constantly trying to prove yourself. And sometimes by proving yourself, there will be people that will try to take others down, right? Because they'll
Absolutely.
think, I'll be a bit higher if I'll do my best to take you down.
Yes.
So how would you then react or answer with love to, say, somebody who is actively trying to put you down or to undermine you?
That's a great question. So the way I view it here in the world is, if somebody is out to physically harm me or somebody else, my family, anyone, I will do what I can to physically intervene. But short of that, anymore, and I wasn't, believe me, I was not like this at all, but anymore, I've come to understand that all the rage, anger, and politics, the political games that people play in the workplace, everywhere in your life, it's really all about them. It's their problem. They can't figure out how to get beyond what, when you said they're trying to get ahead of you, I understand that. But if you're putting somebody down to get ahead, then obviously you're caught in some sort of wave, some sort of vibration that they may not realize this, or with any luck, they will realize it in time. It's pulling them back. They don't understand that. So to answer your question, how do I now handle it? It would be to become that open window as much as possible. And I have this happen. I have it happen quite often. I work part-time. I'm retired from the police department, but I work part-time. I don't want to identify where, but I deal with some very rich people who have some very, some of them, not all of them, some are very decent people, but some of them are, very privileged. They see themselves in a separate system than the rest of mankind. I remember somebody told me just yesterday, a day before yesterday, oh, the guy you're going to deal with is a billionaire. He's really, really rich. I said, I don't care. And they said, and he's a nice guy. I go, that I care about. And he was a nice guy. And I was happy to see that, because a lot of people, they're just stuck in some sort of warp that they can't get themselves out of. And it's sad. It really is. All I can do is wish them well, bless them. That's all I can do, because beyond that, and again, if somebody's physically attacking me, but because I was a police officer, because I faced violence, I have the attribute that I don't have to worry about somebody looking down on me or calling me names. I've had much worse happen in my life,
And I can imagine your NDE has made you more intuitive, and it has definitely showed you the richness of life, or of the world outside of what we know to be true. So then, being in the Air Force and then being a police officer, did that in any way affect your work? And by affect, I mean, did it improve your ability to maybe do the right thing or protect people? Do you feel like it has had an impact?
I believe it had to. Now, I was a young guy, and when somebody gives you a badge and a gun and the power to take people and put them in jail, that can go to your head. And I've seen examples of people around me. They weren't the norm. The norm, as I said earlier, were the vast majority of the men and women I worked with were kind and caring people. But some people did let that power go to their head. And I think for me, somewhere in the process, because I was a patrolman, a detective, a sergeant, a lieutenant, and a captain. So I moved up through the ranks, and I know I didn't step on anyone's back to do it, but I was ambitious. I was ambitious from a career perspective. But if you understand that you're not a body or an ego, if this isn't what there is, if it's something else, then it's like that old biblical phrase that said, what does it profit a man to gain the world but lose his soul? I think there's so much truth in that. And that's how I see it, because the world and all its riches, they can have it. I don't want it. I want what I saw when I was 17. I want that.
Yeah, I often feel like the biggest wealth that you can have is just peace of mind. And to be fair, like, you do need a shelter, you do need food on the table. I'm not talking about not having those basic things, but I do think after a certain point, having a decent house, just making sure that there's food, not worrying about electricity next month, I think after that is just that sense of security and peace that's important.
I agree. You take care of what you need to take care of in the physical world. I was always about doing that. I was always about taking care of myself and my family. But at some point, you realize that you should realize, it would be good to realize that there's much, much more, a much bigger picture than just that. I was very fortunate. My wife was very fortunate. Our family's been very fortunate. We've had our, downside. Everyone does. But I've been taken care of. I have a pension. I got to retire in the world. I understand many, many millions of people don't have anything that comes near that. And I live in an area where there's such a huge disparity between billionaires and people who are just living day to day. I see it all the time here. And I don't feel any differently about any of them. I wish them all well, and I'll help them any way I can. No, I don't want to talk about work. But any way I can help them, I will help them. And usually the best way I can help them, in my opinion, is probably just to listen if they're talking, something I wasn't a natural at. I had to really work at that. And also to bless them, to just reflect back on them what they really need. And I think that's the best thing I can do. And so if, like happened to me not so long ago, a rich person was screaming at me that I was this and that, I won't use the words because it's not suitable for video. I found I found it all very amusing, because again, in my career, I faced guns and knives and far more than words. And I understand the words are just the rantings of somebody who's being tortured. I get that. They're in cycle of torture. And I just said, I hope you have a good day. And I meant it too. I didn't just say it. I really did mean it.
Yeah, that's what rising above it actually stands for.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to the civilizations that you've seen and the other forms of life, because that has been, when you were 17 years old, 72, if I remember correctly. So quite a while ago. And I'm sure after you got back, you were still curious and you still wanted to learn more about that. So do you have now any thoughts on what those other forms of life were that you've seen?
The ones I saw, and I only saw that I recall two, were in human form. They appeared as humans, either ancient or modern. I got the distinct impression there were many, many, many more civilizations, all strewn throughout the universe and the galaxies. I mean, I think there were probably far more than I could even begin to comprehend. But also, it took away sort of as a kid, I was always reading these UFO books, and I was infatuated with it. So my opinion is, my knowledge is actually what I know to be true is, yes, there are other forms of life elsewhere. I know that, but I'm not so. I don't need to seek it out now. I figure whatever is going to reveal itself in time will do that, and I don't really need to know right now whether or not a UFO is hovering over me. I guess unless it's landing in my backyard.
That makes sense. And that brings me to ask you, what do you think has been the biggest impact that you've had in your life after your NDE?
Oh, well, there were a lot. Getting married to my wife was, of course, probably the biggest one, because we were able to forge a life together. And we were very fortunate. We traveled, we went overseas when I was in the Air Force, and then she became a vice president of tourism. And I got to travel with her, and we did many things. I learned how to play music. I played in bands. We went to what were called bluegrass festivals. I'm not sure if you're familiar with what that is. We went to, oh my God, hundreds of those. We kayaked. We climbed mountains. We did great things. We had a family. We got 2 daughters. We were going to have a son, but he was premature and died before birth. And so we had 2 daughters. Let me get this count right: 5 grandchildren and 1 great grandchild. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think I got that right.
Oh, wow. That sounds like a very rich life.
It is. And because I had such a great life, and I'm having such a great life, at least the way I see it, it's freed me from having to. When I was young, I was always pushing. Like I told you, I wanted to learn music. I wanted to play in a band. I wanted to climb a mountain. I wanted to advance in rank in the police department. And I'm glad. I'm very grateful for all those experiences. But at this stage of my life, it's just more gratifying for me to do things like the YouTubes that I do. And I'm on TikTok too, by the way. I resisted that for a while, but I'm also the Wisdom Years on TikTok. So I'm there too. But just these short messages. And I know, because for me personally, what happened was somewhere when I guess I was probably a lieutenant, I'm thinking, when the internet was fairly new, when YouTube was pretty new, I made a video in my bedroom. And this is how this really all started for me in terms of the internet. And I simply turned the phone on. Actually, I was making a guitar video. I was playing a Beatles song. And right after that, I made a video on what happened to me when I was 17. And what began to happen piece by piece is different websites said, can I use your video? And I always gave it away, because I always will. I'm not in this for money. I'm only in it for the truth. I don't care about the money. I really don't. And that's easy for me to say. I have enough to get by. So I guess that could change things. But I personally don't care about it. And because that caught on, it led me to finally say to myself, well, why don't I just do a YouTube channel? And the more people that see that, the better. And I don't really count it, and I don't really care what the outcome is. I mean, I'm always kind of intrigued. Oh yeah, I got a couple more followers. But for me personally, at this stage of my life, it doesn't matter, because I was saying to my family the other day, I said, by my best, estimate, there had to have been at least a couple of million people who have seen my video. And I'm not saying it helped them. Maybe some people didn't like it, or one of my videos. There's been so many now. But I do know that by having the opportunity to see me and so many others, there's been so many that have come forward over the years where I thought I was on an island alone at 17. And I think I know it's comforting some of them, because I know I've gotten text messages and emails. And I'm glad that the truth is comforting to them, because it is the truth.
Yeah, same here. And it's always amazing waking up and seeing comments of people that are helped or resonated. And very often, to be fair, almost daily, I get messages that say, oh, I needed to hear this today. And it always surprises me how the right video seems to show up, when a person most needs it. Because you could say it's the algorithm, but I do think it's maybe like a bit of intuition as well. That somehow,
and maybe the algorithm is tied to intuition, right? Maybe they are kind of interconnected. And I'm not saying I'm not an algorithm fan so much, but I do believe everything happens for the betterment of all of us. I really do. And I realize, I've seen people die. I've seen bad things. And I realize that it can sound like a glib statement, but I think in the long run, in reality, the things that do happen to us, if we allow ourselves to remember, it's all for a purpose that is just beyond our comprehension right here, but it is for a purpose. And if we just allow ourselves to live as good people and honest people, then I think it's all going to unfold perfectly.
I cannot imagine a better note to end on. So Wayne, you've mentioned your YouTube channel. So for anybody that wants to reach out or to find out more about you, could you tell us where can we find your YouTube channel? What's the name of it? And maybe your TikTok as well.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same thing on both. It's The Wisdom Years, Wayne Morrison. So if they search YouTube, that'll come up there, and same for TikTok.